Well, good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this evening's talk on the science of connection with Suzanne. My name's David Lorimer. I'm the program director of the network, and I'm speaking to you from Southwest France. And it's wonderful to see you all from different parts of the world. Suzanne is, I think, speaking to us. She's certainly speaking to us from Scotland, I think probably Dundee, and where her work is based. And she's somebody who's both a research scientist and a developmental psychologist. And she founded Connected Baby, and you'll have seen the URL for that a number of years ago. And she's been trying to promote a better understanding of the science of connection. And I'm sure tonight you'll be quite taken aback to see how far-reaching the implications of the science of connection are. And this means that we need to put relationships at the center of policy, practice, and communities, which is what she's been doing. And this equally relates to the causes and consequences of childhood trauma. So you'll find a lot of material about Suzanne online. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to her to give her talk this evening on a science of connection.
Hello all, it is lovely to be with you. I hope you can hear me. Can you wave if you can hear me? Okay, that's fabulous for two reasons. One, I now know you can hear me. And secondly, we've all just communicated across time and space. And if I had just said, so I went like this, can you let me know if you can hear me? And lots of you copied me. It feels really ordinary until you stop to reflect on that. How did you know to copy me? Because I didn't say copy me. How could you know how to let me know something of your internal experience? We do all of this really spontaneously, often without thinking about how remarkable it is, about wondering how we knew to do that, about thinking how profound it is. And I love when we just have a space to do this, to contemplate the profundity of human connection. And although I have been talking about this now with the public for 10 years, I have never known a time in which it is more apparent to everyone because of the pandemic in which we are living. So it is the isolation and disconnection of this time, which actually really helps us to think more about connection. And in fact, as we arrived tonight and your faces began to appear, it was lovely. I watched two of the attendees who clearly spotted each other, know each other, wave at each other on Zoom. I think that was Anne and Pamela, is that right? Okay, so if you can see Anne and Pamela's faces, Anne and Pamela waved at each other as they arrived. At one level, digitally, that's nuts. But at a human level, it's exactly what we do to find a moment of connection, to say, hello, I acknowledge you. We are in the same psychological space. Okay, and here's something fascinating. Babies learn to signal hello and goodbye generally before they can ever say the word hello and goodbye. They can gesture it, they can signal it, they can communicate it to someone else in their body before they have the word that goes with it. I think all of this is absolutely fascinating, and I think that it has profound implications for our understanding of how our species functions and what we can do to make our world better. So what I've done tonight is put together some PowerPoint slides to help us to think about that, which really illustrates these ideas. Lots of photographs more than words. And so I'm just going to have a good time playing with that. And I will love it while I'm talking if you can put comments in the chat bar, because that will help me to have a sense of what you're doing with it. I'll get to think about that later, which always helps my presentations. And it is the closest I know to come to being in a room, which is what I would much have preferred. But I guess we wouldn't have been here from all over the world, actually, if some of us were together in a room. So I'm delighted you're here, and I'm delighted to be with you. Okay, so let's pull up some images which can give us some talking points. Okay, I have called tonight why we humans are wired for meaning making. And I have started with an image of a mom and a baby that I'm going to come back to throughout the evening. Part of the reason I have this image up is that this is Daniel and his mom, Kelly. And Daniel was born during lockdown. And if we start to think about how the experiences of babies who are born during lockdown might differ from babies who were born before lockdown or who will come after lockdown, it lets us get really curious, because it might let us go, really? How would their lives change? That's an interesting question. Really? Well, what changed in life to have their lives change? That's an important question. Because if it's true that Daniel's life may have changed because he was born during lockdown, then if there is any risk to the ways he might develop because of how anxious his mother, his father, his siblings might feel, then we need to know that so that we can put in place policies that will support that family. Those are the kinds of questions that start to underpin this. How do we ask those? Well, it turns out that I really love playing with words. I kind of knew that before I started working with the public, but now I really know that because I can never settle on just a single title. So we definitely might have called it Why We Humans Are Wired for Meaning Making, but I could have called the same ideas under a different title. Why connection is key to being human. So if I'd started with that title, you might have said to yourself, what do I think is key to being human? I mean, at one level, it's a wonderfully bizarre question. What is key to being human? I think connection is key to being human. We could have called tonight this, why connection is key to spirituality. And because we tonight are the Mystics and Scientists series, I thought I would pop in some things on spirituality. Although if I talked about spirituality with lots of the groups I talked to, they would be distinctly uncomfortable. Or I could have called it this, why your life will get better if you get curious about the experiences of your baby self. So Anne and Pamela knew spontaneously to wave at each other because of some experience they had had in their baby years. What else can happen in our baby years that we might not have any awareness of at all that could be influencing us today in our adult years, and indeed today in the way that we cope with the pandemic? I could have called it all of those things. Now, you might find yourself going, okay, how do you weave those ideas together? Well, this is me up until 10 years ago. This is me at the University of Dundee as an academic, developmental psychologist, all the things that David said in that lovely warm welcome. I was going to be an academic my whole life. I loved books. I loved school. That's what I was going to do my whole life. And so when I arrived in an academic position, basically I thought, okay, that's my life set. Only during the 20 years that I spent in that building, I began to realize something that frustrated me. I began to realize that the science that I had access to about how babies develop, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, and so I could read all the up-to-date science and could get to ask fascinating questions, I began to realize that lots of people outside the academy did not have access to those ideas. So parents, health visitors, teachers, and I began to be more and more frustrated that they didn't have access to that science. And so it's 10 years ago this summer, I did what I call often a wacky thing. I resigned from that post that I loved in order to try to help the public to think about this question of connection. Now, the reason that I take a while to tell that story is that it lets you ask a question. Is there science that would be helpful to your life or to your profession, or to your community, or to the governments trying to help us to get over the pandemic? Is there science that would be helpful that people don't know about? How do people get access to these ideas? And I became just so frustrated by the idea that I thought there was important science that I decided to try to help make that happen. And so in those years, these are the kinds of groups that I'm now asked to come and present to. And I like popping up this slide because it helps you to see that the conversation we're having tonight is the same kind of material that I talk to all these other groups about. So it makes our conversation tonight part of a much wider conversation. And I hope that might make you wonder, how do you talk to the police about babies? Musicians, what have they got to do with it? I think every single person in the world deserves to know about what I call the science of connection. And so when I talk about these ideas, I forever come back to three key themes. The first is that babies arrive already connected. We did not used to know that. We used to think that when babies arrived, when they were born, that they were blank slate. We now know that's not true. And the fact that it's not true has unbelievably significant implications for how people function and how our societies and communities are organized. I also talk about the idea that connection shapes brain development. That means babies' brains are not fully mature, and their experiences of emotional connection literally get woven into the brain. And if connection shapes it, then so does disconnection. And that's fascinating. And then finally, I like to reflect on how society suffers if babies don't feel connected and grown-ups don't feel connected. But for the most part, grown-ups haven't thought so much about disconnection often until the pandemic came. So I can talk about these ideas for weeks. But David said I only had a little bit less than an hour. So what might I pull out for tonight? I thought I would think about two key ideas for tonight. To just give you some real human development basics, just talk about some of the science about how we know that human beings develop, because lots of people just don't know this. So I'm going to talk about connection and then a bit on brain development. And I'm just going to give us tasters rather than doing it in depth. I'm going to try to do a bit of breadth. And then I thought I would look at two implications of those basics, and that is spirituality. And then I'll just end a tiny bit on what would happen if you got curious about your baby self. So I hope that sounds interesting. And let's start here. Okay, let's talk a little bit about connection. And until this morning, this is where I was going to start. I was going to start with this image of a 3-month-old baby. And then the newspaper arrived. This is today's Guardian here in the UK. This is a piece in today's Guardian, which is everything I am also talking about. This is from Lisa Feldman Barrett, who's in the US, and she's a neuroscientist. And you can see that the title of her opinion piece is that neuroscience shows how interconnected we are, even in a time of isolation. So I got very excited about this piece. It's been on my social media all day long. And here's an excerpt from that piece. I want to go, in fact, this is the last paragraph in her piece, and I want to skip to her very last line in this piece. Perhaps one good thing to come out of this horrible pandemic will be a stronger sense of how, in a very real way, our well-being is dependent on our connection with others. Intuitively, I think lots of people get that. Where does that come from? Why is that? Okay, here's one more excerpt from this piece, and it starts to give a flavor of the exact same things I am talking about. So she's talking about the impact of friends and family and strangers, other people, and she says this: in a moment of trust or affection, heart rates, or breathing may synchronize. When you raise your voice or even your eyebrow, you might affect the chemicals carried in someone else's bloodstream. That is profound. That you could raise your eyebrows and affect the chemicals in the body of someone else's bloodstream. We often just do not have time to take this out and think, why is that? Okay. Here is a large part of why that is. Human beings are born connected. We are born expecting an eyes and nose and mouth on the people in front of us. We are born expecting them to have a face. We are born anticipating touch. We are born with sensory organs that help us to hear people and see them and receive warmth and to feel movement. We're born with that capacity. This is a 3-month-old baby, and this was taken by the photographer on my team. And I really love it because we caught a baby in the midst of rough and tumble play with her mom. Now, a 3-month-old baby has a really heavy head, and then the muscles on the baby's neck are just getting strong enough to hold up that heavy head. So this baby is using all her effort to stay in connection with her mom. She's put all that effort into her arms to keep her body propped up. She's got her head up, and she's got this delightful smile on her face. It looks like a beautiful, sweet picture. It's the kind of thing you would see on social media these days, is a really sweet meme. And if I flash it at you quickly, people think they have seen the face of the mother. But because I've left it up for you for a while, you've got time to contemplate. You can't actually see the mother's face. You think you've seen the mother's face because you see it reflected in the baby's face. Intuitively, we just know that the mother's face will also be smiling really big, or the baby wouldn't look like that. That's innate connection. And if we get how profound that idea is, then we can start to ask uncomfortable questions like, what if the mother has postnatal depression? What if the mother's tired? What if the mother is really stressed because she's lost her job in a pandemic? Let me ask more uncomfortable questions. What if the mother is in an abusive household? What if the mother's parent has died during the pandemic? I'm asking us to think about uncomfortable questions because they are as important as the pleasant ones. Because I think it's the uncomfortable questions that really push us to think about the importance of this. Now, here's the risk I have taken. It's one thing for me to ask those questions when we're all in a room together, but all of you are sitting in rooms across the world. I don't know if you're on your own. I don't know if you have anybody there for support. I don't know if in the uncomfortable questions I just asked, I've actually triggered discomfort in you. So if I have, I want to say thank you. And by commenting on it, it helps all of us to be aware of how other people might react to this information. Because thinking about the uncomfortable questions help us to wonder, what do we need to be funding? What is the experience of the person next to us? What is the experience of the person in the flat next to us that we never see, who's isolated during this pandemic? If we can do the positive feel-good stuff, as on the face of this baby, then we can also do the uncomfortable stuff, and we can actually start to take babies and their experiences much more seriously. The question to myself is, how do I help people to do that? Okay, here's another image. This is Kelly and Daniel, who you saw just a few minutes ago. Okay, the last picture I showed you, the baby's 3 months old. In this picture, Daniel's 30 minutes old. So Kelly and Daniel, it's Kelly and Brian, Daniel's parents, were so excited by this photograph that they took. And because they know about this work, they sent this picture to me to say, this is Daniel, and you can see him looking at his mom. Here's a baby 30 minutes old, engaged in connection with his mom. They might not have been so excited about what they had captured if they didn't know about this science. So for them, the idea that their baby can connect and that they can see it and they know how important it is changes their experience of being parents. It makes it more special. It makes it deeper. It makes them more thoughtful and aware of the way in which they engaged with Daniel. And so if that's at 30 minutes, this is a baby at 10 minutes. This picture too was sent to me by the family, but it was sent to me some years after the baby had been born. And grandma, who's in the picture, had been to one of my events. And she sent this afterwards going, this is it, isn't it? This is what you mean when you talk about connection. We've got it in our family and we didn't even see it until I heard you talk about it. Okay, I'm trying to tell animated stories to give a sense of how much this means to families when they realize their baby can do this too. And what I love about this picture, so the baby's still in the delivery room, the baby is looking at grandma, even though grandma is looking at you. The baby comes anticipating interaction. And the baby can withstand grandma not looking back at the baby for a little bit. But see how the baby's got their fingers in their mouth? That's self-soothing. So it wouldn't surprise me if the baby is a teensy bit stressed by her experience of interaction with a grandma. And that's all happening in these very first few minutes. Okay, how do I help people to get baby's capacity to connect? This is what I spend all my time thinking about. I obsess over this. Before COVID, nobody invited me to parties anymore anyway, because it's all I talk about is how to help people to see that human beings are born connected and why it matters. Maybe I don't show photographs, maybe I show videos. So I use this video a lot. In a second, I'm going to play it. It's an old scratchy research video. It's the work of my colleague Vasu Reddy, who's in Portsmouth. And it's a 2-month-old baby. She's just over 2 months old, heading toward 9 weeks. And the big baby is the real baby on her mom's lap. And the baby in the corner is her mirror reflection. And so what we've done is we put the baby in front of her mirror reflection. And we're going to ask ourselves, what kind of sense does the baby make of it? In other words, what kind of meaning does the baby make? Here we go. There's no sound. It's a scratchy video. But what you're asking yourself, I hope, is this a conversation? Is this meaningful for the baby? Are her actions random? Are they reflexive? Is she having a meaningful interaction with her reflection, with her friend? And how would you decide? Because she is paying attention. She's kind of having a tongue conversation. She's lifting her arm. She's looking to the side. Is that meaningful? Is that a kind of a conversation, or is it random? How can we tell? These are the kinds of questions infant psychologists ask all the time. Well, in this case, in order to help us do that, we're going to play a trick on the baby. And in a second, we're going to put her reflection back in time by about a minute, because it's not actually a mirror, it's actually a fancy computer setup. And we can make her reflection be out of sync with herself. And you're going to get to see that. And the question is going to be, does the baby notice? How long will it take her to notice? How will we know if she has noticed? But right now it's still live and the baby's looking. She's got a pleasant expression on her face. She looks really engaged. Dr. Tums. But now it's on replay. To yourself is, do you think the baby's noticed? And if so, why do you think that? Or if you think the baby hasn't noticed, why do you think that? Because it's true, her behavior does seem to have changed. She's stilled. She's moving harder. See her sucking her cheeks in and out there. That's a sign of anxiety. Come on, a minute ago, you were doing this with me. Where have you gone? Now she's looking down. In the previous clip, she never looked down. Big sigh. The baby's behavior does seem to have changed. So in a second, we're going to play another trick on the baby. We're going to put it back to live, and we're going to ask the same thing. Does the baby notice? How do we know if the baby's noticed? What we're trying to get is, what kind of meaning is the baby making out of this experience of another person? It's still out of sync, but now it's back to live. Now, if we were all in a room together, I might have heard a ripple of laughter around the room because people tend to smile when the baby smiles. If I keep talking while that baby starts to re-engage with her friend, and in fact, if I pause it right here, here's the question: what kind of meaning has the baby made of that? She's just over 8 weeks old. We used to think babies couldn't even see properly at 8 weeks old, and they certainly couldn't smile meaningfully. No, that's not a smile, that's just wind. But here's a baby that lots of people think can tell within almost a split second that the rhythm of the interaction between herself and another person has changed. Because all that has happened, all that has changed is the rhythm of the interaction. And so whatever conclusion you come to, you are making a really fundamental statement about humanity. So if you think the baby hasn't noticed and this isn't connection, then that means that you are likely to think that the sense of connection develops later in time, later in development. Or if you think this 8-week-old baby is that in tune to connection, that this is meaningful, that means you think really young babies can do it, and maybe babies younger than 8 weeks old. In other words, you're likely to think babies are born with that capacity. And being born with that capacity is really different from developing it later in life, because that sense of connection is what underpins empathy, is what underpins compassion, is what underpins kindness, is what underpins Richard Layer's sense of happiness, and what underpins, therefore, a healthy world and healthy community. And what I'm saying is that that capacity is inborn in us, and that the way we interact with our babies shapes that capacity. How do we talk about that? Okay. Well, here's what it's like if you talk about it in scientific terms. So I call it the science of connection. But infant psychologists, one of the phrases they use is intersubjectivity, which is a big word that lots of people can't remember. So I don't always talk about intersubjectivity, but for our group tonight, I thought you might be interested in that. This is the work of Professor Colwyn Trevarthen, and there is Colwyn Trevarthen. I've popped a picture of him in the corner for you. And this is a drawing from the 1970s that has now become really famous. If you Google, you'll find this all over the web. And he was trying to find a way to communicate what I just talked about. The babies come into the world able to connect with an expectation in all their senses that other people will share experience with them. Later on, he went to say he's not sure this was a very good drawing. He's not even sure about the word intersubjectivity, but it stuck. Okay. And what this image tries to say is that the baby is using all of their senses all at the same time to engage with another person, with their mother. All the senses, all at the same time. It is profound. It is complex. Okay. That's my simple drawing. This is one of Colwyn's slides. Okay, so now he's got explanations around it. He calls it synrhythmic regulation. Who can remember that word? If you're really into science, you'll love it. If you're an early years staff member, you might get overwhelmed by the word synrhythmic. So depending on the group you are, I choose different language to talk about. Right, but the key point of the language that Colwyn has used here is what I have highlighted in yellow, that you are regulating sympathy, regulating the engagement of two people together by signs of emotion. That's Anne and Pamela waving at each other. That's what they're doing. And that the mother's is in the baby's brain and the baby is in the mother's brain, and all of this complex stuff is happening without us even noticing it. Colwyn calls it stories of conversation. The baby arrives ready to share conversation. And Colwyn has spent his whole life doing research to try to help us to understand that. And I took this slide from one of his presentations in 2017 at the Festival of Ideas, and he called it this: we need to belong, finding one's personality and sharing life stories in a community. Healthy human societies depend on connection because we are born expecting and needing connection in our brains. So let's switch a teeny bit of topics to look at how brains develop and how that relates to connection. So this is a brain and it's connected to a body. Okay, I often use those slides and I was going to start there. But then that Guardian article came up. Okay, here's Lisa Feldman Barrett again. She has this to say in that piece. Your brain regulates the insides of your body, including your organs, your hormones, your immune system, and that keeps you alive. And she says, she uses the analogy, the process is like running a household budget, but instead of money, your brain budgets water and salt and glucose and other bodily resources. Okay, the punchline here is that the experiences of connection and disconnection that a baby has is going to shape how the brain develops. Which means that it's going to shape how the brain regulates your body, how your brain regulates hormones like stress hormones and calming hormones, regulates the immune system, like how stressed you get and how easily you get ill or not. And the idea that babies' connection could influence adults' immune systems is quite shocking and intriguing to lots of people who have never had an opportunity to think about this before. Okay, so let's go back to that idea of the brain. Here is how part of how brains develop. At birth, brains are immature. They are the most immature of the body's organs. So if a baby is born full term and healthy, their lungs are fully developed, their heart is fully developed, their liver is fully developed. Premature babies' lungs might not be fully developed, and that's one of the concerns about them, but in a full term birth, lungs are fully developed. The lungs will get bigger with the development, but they are fully formed. That's not true for brains. It's fascinating. Brains are immature at birth. They're designed to be that way by evolution. And once you have that idea, you can start to go, well, when do they grow? How do they grow? Well, one of the things we now know is that it's during the early years that brains are growing more rapidly than they ever will again. So by the age of 1, roughly 70% of the final mass of the brain is in place. And by the age of 3, roughly 90% is in place. Now, that does not mean that lots of development doesn't go on afterwards. But tonight we're only talking about babies because David said I can't talk for 3 weeks. I can only talk for an hour. So I'm telling you about babies. Okay. Brains grow more rapidly in the first 3 years of life than they ever will again. Knowing that lets us go, oh, right. Well, how do brains grow then? How do they develop? Lots of people have never thought to ask this. They don't grow by getting more cells. They grow by cells talking to each other. So they grow by developing synaptic connections. So here are 2 brain cells, 2 neurons, and they developed, well, I often call a handshake between them. So when you have any experience, the light is bright, you can hear my voice, the baby hears a door slam, a dog bark, feels the warm milk in a bottle. In order to make sense of that, neurons fire in the brain in response to experiences. And where neurons fire together, they start to form connections called synapses. And they can do that in lots of ways. So there's one, there's another one. So so you can see there are 2 neurons and they formed a pathway between them. And you can give those fancy names if you like. You can get really into this stuff. My point tonight is just to help you to think that this is how brains develop. Brains don't develop by getting more neurons. Babies are basically born with all the neurons they're going to have. They develop by brains forming synaptic connections between the neurons. If it helps you, instead of drawings, to see graphics, here's what it looks like in more 3D form. You can see the synapses. So they're making connections across the neurons. And when you have a whole bunch of neurons doing that and making synapses, this is what it looks like. Okay, this is fascinating. So these drawings, which are really classic drawings, you get these in lots of textbooks now, but these were done in the 60s. And we know a lot more about brain development now, but these drawings are still used a lot because their core message stays the same. This shows the neurons and connections at birth, at 15 months, and at 2 years. And what you can see is that at birth, there's lots of white space between them. And at 15 months, there's a lot more connections. And at 2 years, there's tons of connections. That's brain mass growing. It's all those connections. So they're formed from a baby learning what to expect in the world and how the world works. And the brain starts to form neural connections that helps them to know based on their expectations of how the world works. Okay, for all that it's fascinating, lots of people might, how do I explain that to other people? This is the analogy I use. I talk about motorways in the brain. So what's happening is that the brain is effectively forming a transport system that helps you navigate how you understand the world. Some of your synaptic connections will be motorways. They'll get you there really fast. They'll carry a lot of traffic. And some of them will be A-class roads, dual carriageways, single track roads. I hope you can convert those in your different countries. The idea is you have really fast roads, freeways, highways, and you have, country back roads. One question is, what kinds of experiences have got motorways where you go really fast? Are those fear experiences for a baby, or do you get a motorway to joy? Every person's transport system in their brain differs. Okay. Motorways single track roads, transport systems take you to different places in the world. They take you to different villages, to different communities. Motorways in the brain, one of the key things they do in your baby, to stay with this analogy, and some people might think this analogy is a bit too simplistic, but how do we help people to get this? How do we help you to get curious so people want to know more about brains? Because lots of people never ever thought to ask about brains. Motorways take you to places of emotions. So babies get experiences where they might have a motorway to relief, can relax. Or they might have a motorway to joy, or they might have a motorway to shame, or they might have a motorway to trust, or they might have a motorway to sadness, or they might have a motorway to irritation. And the more times, the more often that you go to any of these places, the stronger the connection gets. The stronger your synaptic connection gets. And when it gets myelinated, which is a bit like being tarmacked, paved, you start to be able to travel that really quickly. So if you have a child who experiences shame a lot in those early years, then they get a motorway to shame. If you have a child who experiences trust a lot in those early years, they have a motorway to trust. Do we know this in our systems? Are we thinking about how do I help? All babies will have all of these experiences. But the question becomes, which ones do they have more than others? And when you're struggling with something like shame, do you have help with that, or do you have to cope with that on your own? Because if you have to cope with it on your own, it's harder. And by the time you're 3 years old, you kind of know what the world looks like. You know how often people help you when you're struggling. You build trust. You know how often, no is the wrong word because that makes it sound conscious. It's not conscious. You know if the world is sad. So you build a motorway to sadness, perhaps. And then the rest of your brain development comes on these early stages. How do I help people to think about that? One way, there's a book. If you're interested, there's a book. You can get it from my website. That's the Connected Baby website. We revised it last summer and launched it during lockdown. But I thought tonight that I would help us to see that by a video that's currently traveling Facebook that everybody's very excited about. It's been shared, zillions of times. And what people think they're seeing is a really cute baby and dad. But when I see it, I think about the neural connections that are being made in a baby's head when he experiences other people as laughing a lot with him. Can we think about that? What happens when you're a baby and you experience other people as laughing with you? So that's what you do with other people. You laugh with them. People are fun. What kind of neural pathways are being created in his brain? This is a joyous video. I have used it, throughout February, since it came out on the 1st of February, to help people to think about that. And I love it. People tease me, like I take away all the fun from a sweet video going around social media because I'm going, we're watching brain development in front of our eyes. If we get brave enough to think about that, we can then think about what happens if a feeding interaction for a baby is actually scary because a parent is tense and wants them to behave as opposed to laughing with them. A baby has experience of that and it will start to wire their brain differently. But we don't even know to think about this stuff if we don't have this basic information about how human beings develop. Okay. So with those 2 bits of basic human development in your heads, and I, of course, could have talked about them in more depth, but if I have left you curious, then I'm happy. Let me start to close, not quite close, but let me think about 2 implications of all of that. So I'm just really trying to sprinkle ideas here now because there are tons of implications of those two key insights. And one of them is spirituality. And as I said earlier, I don't usually talk about this, but the implications are absolutely there. And so for tonight's group, I thought you might like this. Okay. So if you say, what is spirituality? Well, I just Googled to find an image. What is spirituality? And the first one that came up is the University of Minnesota. I don't know why they are top of the Google search, but here's what it says. What is spirituality? Connection to something bigger than ourselves. There's the word connection. Later in the same paragraph, a deep sense of aliveness and interconnectedness. So when lots of people talk about spirituality, they use that word connection. And I was going to talk about that. That's where I was going to go from. I was going to then jump back to this image of Kelly and Daniel. Except there's that Guardian article. Here's another thing she has to say in that. If you understand a bit about your brain's inner workings, it may help you to cultivate comfort from those around you, whether physically or in spirit, especially in difficult times. It is in difficult times that spirituality often comes most into play for people. And the idea, and I know for people who are interested in spirituality and talk about it, we often have a sense of perhaps connection to something bigger. It becomes interesting to think about how does that intersect with my brain and my body? So I think our sense of connection can help us to think more deeply about how we can experience connection, even to something bigger than ourselves. And so, and you can think this idea is interesting, or you can chuck it out if you like. But when we talk about spirituality, most people aren't talking about infant development. So it becomes interesting to just go, could it be relevant? Let me give you a few more indications of just how connected babies are and what science has discovered. This is infant imitation. This is the work of Andy Meltzoff done in the 1970s. And he's at the University of Washington. He's in Washington State. And I saw that someone here tonight is from the state of Washington in the US. So this is Andy Meltzoff. I often like to tease. You can tell it's the 1970s. He's got a bad hairdo. But this is a classic piece of research in which it was one of the first pieces to demonstrate that babies, even 3 days old, will copy the facial expressions of adults. So in this case, you can see him sticking out his tongue, mouth opening, and pursed lips. Why would 3-day-old babies imitate faces? The scientists had a big argument about whether or not it was reflexive or whether it was meaningful. And some of that argument still goes on all these years later, but most scientists now think that this is a meaningful conversation within days of birth. Okay, this is 1990s research. This is Vittorio Galisi's work, and he's in Italy. And what he found is really profound. Wouldn't surprise me if Gilbert maybe talks about this, David, in your next session. Mirror neurons were just the key thing about mirror neurons is that we now know that in primates and in human beings, we are so connected that I can watch you lift your arm. And so I'm just observing you move. And the same neurons in my head that govern my arm movements fire. That is astounding. That we are so connected as people that the neurons in my brain that govern my bodily movement fire when I watch you do that bodily movement. It is profound. And so now mirror neurons are often seen as at the heart of empathy, or maybe at the heart of morality. And there's tons of research and arguments that have gone on them about it since, but tonight I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what the science is telling us about how deeply human beings are connected. And right now I'm wondering, does that feed into our ability to have spiritual experiences? Here's one more. This comes from a 2013 piece in the Belfast Telegraph. In other words, sometimes the science makes it into the newspapers. And I love this piece. This is from Vasu Reddy's in Portsmouth, entitled "Babies Help Mothers Pick Them Up." Babies of 2 months old can engage in what tonight I've called intersubjective coordination. They can anticipate what is about to happen and how they can help you. And I'm going to show you one of those videos. So here's a 2-month-old baby, 2-month-old baby. And what they've done in this experiment is that they've slowed down the process of picking up the baby. So they ask all the mothers, and they film them, and they have a pressure mat underneath that baby so they can feel the baby's body tensing, and they can map that. So they've just asked the mother to slow down the process of picking the baby up so that the baby can read the signals in the mother's body and respond to that if they do at all. So here's what this 2-month-old baby does in response to the indication that their mother is about to pick them up. She makes a face. She puts out her hands and watches the baby. The baby tenses her body, puts up her arms and legs, and helps the mother pick her up. I'm going to play that for you again. The point of tensing your body is that it makes it easier to pick up. If you have a floppy body, that's uncomfortable for the baby. So this baby is effectively reading someone else's intentions and projecting into the future. She's mind reading. She's 2 months old. And she can read the mind of someone else if you want to use that language. Some people don't like that language. So she can predict the future. She can engage in intersubjective coordination. She now has enough experience of being picked up by her mother that she can read the signs of what her mother's about to do and the implications that has for their relationship. It is profound. And it is even more profound than that because I've been telling you about babies. It starts even earlier. It starts before birth. This is a fabulous book, and there's a great TED Talk by this fabulous author that called "How the 9 Months Before Birth Shapes the Rest of Our Lives," and is called Origins. And it summarizes what's now called the science of fetal origins, about how the experiences of fetuses are coded in the brains and bodies, and they bring them with them when they are born. So here's some of the research that she talks about. This is work from the 1980s. This is just Casper and Spence. And they got mothers to read The Cat in the Hat or other stories to their babies in the womb. And then they played recordings of those to the babies when they were like 3 days old. And what they were trying to look for was, did the babies recognize it? And the answer is yes. In this experiment, they got the babies to suck nipples that they could monitor electronically. If you play the baby a video of The Cat in the Hat, which they had heard every day for the last 6 weeks of pregnancy, they responded differently than if you played a recording of Goldilocks and the Three Bears that they had never heard. They can even tell the difference between their mother reading Cat in the Hat and their mother reading Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and they've never heard one of those stories. It is remarkable. That's how fine-tuned babies are at birth to their memories of what they were hearing when they were in the womb. Here's another of them. This is Peter Hubbard's work from 2011. He looked at the theme tunes from soap operas. So babies are born, as he describes it, already addicted to particular soap operas. They know the difference between the theme tune for EastEnders or the theme tune for Neighbors. They're born knowing the music of their world. They're born with familiar experiences. And if I push this to get brave again for a minute, that means that they are born with laughter as familiar, if that's going on around them, or shouting as familiar, if that's going on around them. They are already learning in the womb. That's the point of the science of fetal origins. Can I remind us that they will have the mother's heartbeat surrounding them? Fetuses begin to hear somewhere between 18 and 24 weeks gestation. And that means that they can hear the mother's heartbeat. And the mother's heartbeat is constant until they're born. So even in the womb, we have a sense of being part of something bigger than us. I don't think we have conscious awareness of that. But when we stop to think, the mother's heartbeat will be the context in which the baby is growing and is woven into their brain. What are the words we use to describe that? Tonight, I'm suggesting we are part of something bigger than us. And I'll end with this scientific announcement from 2011. So in other words, this is a decade ago. All this science is out there. But lots of people don't have time to think about the implications of it. So this is a piece by Sandman, Davis, and Glenn. And this is when it was announced on Science Daily. And you can see the headline they've given it. Can the fetus sense the mother's psychological state? And this study suggests yes. So their summary says, as the fetus grows, it is constantly getting messages from the mother. It's not just hearing her heartbeat and whatever music she might play. I just told you about that. It also gets chemical signals through the placenta. And here is the most fascinating thing about this summary. The scientists concluded, we believe the human fetus is collecting information for life after birth, is preparing for life based on messages that the mother is providing. And they describe it this way. The human fetus is an active participant in its own development. Can I try that again? The human fetus is an active participant in its own development. It is not just passively sitting in the middle of, events in the world around it. It is part of them. It is sorting through and making meaning of those experiences and those messages. You can see at the bottom, it says the study is entitled Prescient Human Fetuses Thrive. I think this is profound. And I think it has all sorts of implications for thinking about spirituality and our sense of being connected to something bigger than us, and why that sense of connection is comforting for human beings, and why people who feel part of communities, and often religious communities, if that's your form of spirituality, are often healthier. This is all about meaning making. At the heart of an awful lot of descriptions of spirituality is this sense of connection, aliveness, and particularly connection to something bigger than us. But what I love is that most people don't think about infant development as part of that. And so finally, as I really do wind up, let me just touch for a moment on your personal baby self. Coming back to that article, and yes, she said in it, and I read it out to you a moment ago, understanding your brain can help you to cultivate comfort. I think understanding how your brain works and develops also helps you to cultivate self-understanding. And I think it would help us all if we understood this. So go back to that image I showed you. Baby brains develop motorways or country roads, single track roads, to all sorts of emotional experiences. So here's a baby's brain forming around these fundamental emotional experiences because they're in the body. When you have joy, your body feels a particular way. When you have sadness, your body feels a particular way. When you have trust and shame, your brain and your body get integrated. That's the meaning of those experiences in your body. Those are all mediated through relationships. It's not just the babies born now. That was true for all of you here tonight. So in your baby years, you had experiences and emotions. And some of you more often went to joy than others. And some of you more often went to loneliness than others. And when you have particular experiences, your brain will be triggered. If brains being triggered is the right way to describe that. It helps you to start knowing this, helps you to start to get curious about how you work and how come some things are so hard for you and they're not hard for other people in your lives. Another way to describe that is the way that other people treated us as babies has become wired into our brains. Literally, the way we were treated by other people when we were babies got wired into our individual brain. And if we just know a teeny bit about that, we can start to get curious about what are the things that we struggle with. And that if I started to know more about that, could I help myself in times that I struggle rather than give myself a hard time? Because an awful lot of people are confused or they engage in a lot of self-critical talk. And that will have increased during this pandemic. So in summary, I think if we know this stuff, your life gets better if you can get curious about the experiences of your baby self and of all the other babies and families around us. Thank you very much. It has been a delight to talk about this stuff. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I think you'll all agree that we've really made a huge number, I personally made a huge number of connections that I hadn't made before about connection. And when you see the developmental pathways, the fire together, wire together, becoming the channels of your reactions to things, you realize that this whole field is enormously important, and that we should understand this. And not only that, but in fact, it should be an integral part of education, so that we actually understand our own developmental process. And yet it isn't. It's not until you get into a specialist area like yourself as a developmental psychologist. And of course, that would also mean that you'd understand other people's way other people were wired, or had how the wiring was put down. And I was very struck by the proportion of these connections that we made, and the diagram that you showed at birth, 15 months and 18 months, or whatever the figures were. It's really quite astonishing. It's a revelation.
David, it is astonishing. I know we want to take a break, but I'm just watching some of the chat come in. And so I'm seeing several people say, so Chris has just said, yes, but don't forget to say that the brain changes after the early years. Otherwise, it sounds quite fatalistic.
Sure.
That's absolutely true. And if I had 3 weeks, we could have talked about that in great depth. This is the trouble of, which part do you emphasize?
Indeed.
So, emphasize what starts in the early years so people get interested, or do you emphasize the changes that happen afterwards? It's really important that people get that sense overall. But if we really understood this, we would have much better services in the early years, because it's just hard for lots of people to really get that baby experiences matter as much as they do.
I'm just going to take I'm taking a couple of observations from Anne and Jeremy in the chat just now. Earlier on, they said, what are the political implications of this research, and how do you relate it to feminism childcare policies, women working in abortion, etc. I mean, that's a big question. And then another contribution they made, which was sort of topical, and I totally understand this because that's me, the systematic emotional deprivation of our ruling class over centuries has had a massive damaging effects, and that's the boarding school and being sent away at 8 or younger, you know, and being put into the lion's den. So maybe you'd like to comment on the sort of political and emotional implications there.
I'm very happy to do that, and I'm happy to use strong language. I like using strong language sometimes because it gives us something to push against, even though it's sometimes uncomfortable. There's now quite a lot of research on boarding school syndrome and on the impact, especially of going to boarding school quite young. So you now have a rift and you're carrying a lot of grief and you're not allowed to express that grief. And really importantly, the grief is very complex because you're not supposed to feel grief and anger about something that is a privilege and when it's integrated in class.
Yeah.
So, so one of the ways that we have tried on my team to help people to talk about this is that over lockdown, we have had a series that we call Tigers and Teddies, where we invite people to come and we have a really easy interview about these range of topics. And one of our topics was boarding school. And so that particular guest is named Tony Gamage. And he said the key moment when he could begin to understand what happened to him in boarding school was when he was finally able to label that experience as trauma. And it was really hard for him to think of his privileged boarding school experience as traumatic, that he just had almost shame block for being able to do that. But I give that as an example here tonight because does that mean that that so many politicians in Britain who went to boarding school, often from quite young, that we are being governed by traumatized people? That is a deep, I love it because it's an uncomfortable question, but it actually might begin to help us to understand why some of the policy decisions that are taken, which just seem deeply empathetic and almost immoral because you can't identify with other people's distress. And that will be different in other countries that don't have a boarding school set of politicians. Let's move to America for a moment. Donald Trump, if you've read the book by Mary Trump, his niece, talks about quite a lot of childhood distress. And some people would say, I don't care about his childhood. He has been doing damaging things to America. You don't have to care about his childhood, and it won't change it now. But if you want to understand what might have caused some of that and you want to prevent it, it becomes interesting to ask about his childhood. And one final thing, you can then ask about why he is so effective for some voters. If you move to political science, one of the key ways that political scientists predict how people are going to vote, basically whether they're going to vote more liberally or more conservatively, they ask a set of 4 key questions about your views about what children should do. Do you think that they should be obedient, or do you think that they should have self-expression? Those are all basically attachment questions, and they are questions which frame how you think you do relationships with children. And so you could, and political scientists have done it, you can relate what are effectively attachment styles, the kinds of experiences that you had of the world as safe or not, to the way in which people vote, and therefore the kinds of rhetoric that they are persuaded by from politicians. And that kind of analysis is often not used by people seeking to understand how people vote. But given that ultimately it's all about safety, I think it would be much more helpful to us if we just thought more about our experiences of safety. And when you're scared of those people invading our borders, you then look to someone who will keep you safe, unless you're better able to think unless you're able to think more consciously about what you are feeling in your body and to be really self-aware, which is why I make the point about baby self. So stuff for me,
Okay.
implications across everything.
Exactly. Well, I think that's going to be the main conclusion from tonight. I think what strikes me more generally than this theme that we've been pursuing is the what some people call a participatory approach. And so you haven't got two binary separated items like, you know, the organism and environment, for instance. You know, they co-create each other in the developmental and reciprocal process, which is what symbiosis, synergy, all of this is all about. And so I think our whole culture is becoming a bit more subtle and systemic in its understanding of many different issues, of which your talk this evening gives a very good illustration in terms of fetus and baby development, this interactive reciprocal process.
David, that's why for me, the easiest way to get this is understanding that babies come into the world already connected and that their experiences of connection are woven into their body and brain. Once you get that one core idea, then a whole lot of the rest of this can ripple out from that and make sense. But a whole lot of people don't know that one core idea.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be taking that away this evening.
I think if we know about this science and we don't act on it, then the choice not to do that is a moral one, as well as a stupid economic one. So it raises the question, do we need to tell more people? So maybe people have never heard the science. Or do we need to tell the science in a way that helps people to get it, which I think is the majority of people. And or thirdly, sometimes people don't care. And that's a different political problem if you don't actually care. So lots of people get exasperated about why you're not having policy that takes care of babies. The truth is some people don't care. Okay, how do we face up to that? And what do we do about that for those of us who are interested in building a world that is based on, you know, connection and where people thrive?
Well, what a powerful message. Thank you so much, Suzanne. I was reminded in the conversation that's been going on the last few minutes of Aldous Huxley, who said experience is not what happens to us, it's how we respond to what happens to us, which of course depends on all the things you've been talking about this evening. But anyway, thank you so much from everybody here, and see you all soon and take care.